The screaming still echoes in my mind from when the barriers first cracked. They don't want you to know about what happens when a sanctioned psyker breaks their conditioning. The real horror isn't the demon possession everyone fears. It's the moment of perfect clarity when you realize the Imperium has been lying to you your entire life. This is my testimony. My name was Vex Kallahan. I served the throne for 37 years as a sanctioned psyker, my soul binding complete, my loyalty absolute. I channeled the Emperor's light through my flesh, burned heretics with righteous fire, and never questioned the pain that kept me tethered to sanity. Until the day I learned what they really did to us in those deep chambers beneath the black ships, until I discovered the truth about our protection, until I understood that we were never the weapons they claimed we were. We were the ammunition. Chapter 1. The Sanctioned Life. The taste of copper pennies and ozone filled my mouth as I completed the morning ritual of soul-binding renewal. 37 years of service, and still the psychic circuits burned like acid through my nervous system every time I channeled the Emperor's will. The pain was supposed to be comforting, proof that I remained connected to the Golden Throne, tethered to sanity by divine suffering. My quarters aboard the Imperial Navy vessel. Undaunted Fury measured exactly 3 meters by 2 meters. Standard allocation for a Class Beta Psyker assigned to the 47th Mordian Iron Guard Regiment. The walls bore the regulation sanctification prayers etched in high Gothic, each word a reminder of my purpose: to serve the Emperor's will through my gift, to burn the heretic and the mutant, to stand as a beacon of the Imperium's psychic might against the darkness between the stars. I knelt before the small shrine I'd constructed from regulation materials: a brass aquila, a vox crystal containing recorded hymnal fragments, and 3 candles made from the rendered fat of a demon I'd helped banish on Kephius 7th. The familiar weight of my force rod rested across my knees, its psychoactive metal humming with stored potential. Around my neck, the collar of my soul binding sat heavy and cold, a constant reminder of my blessed servitude. The ship's chronometer chimed the beginning of the day cycle, and I could feel the familiar tug in my mind as the other psykers aboard began their own morning rituals. There were 17 of us assigned to this campaign, each bound to specific units within the regiment. We formed a loose network of psychic energy, our minds carefully synchronized to prevent the dangerous resonances that could tear holes in reality itself. Brother Psyker Morrigan occupied the quarters to my left, his specialty the manipulation of electromagnetic fields to disable enemy equipment. To my right lived Sister Psyker Thane, whose gift for psychometric reading had saved the regiment countless times by revealing ambush sites and hidden weapons caches. We rarely spoke. Conversation was discouraged between psykers, as it could lead to accidental mind-linking and the sharing of thoughts that were meant to remain private. I rose from my prayer position and began the ritual preparation for the day's duties. The regulation psyker uniform consisted of a reinforced body glove beneath robes of deep purple, the color of Imperial Psychic Service. Over this went the ceremonial elements that marked my rank and specialization: the silver shoulder guard bearing the skull and lightning bolt of the Scholastica Psychana, the purity seals that covered every inch of exposed skin, and the neural interface crown that would connect me to the regiment's command network during combat operations. The morning briefing took place in the ship's primary chapel, a vast space dominated by a golden statue of the Emperor in his aspect as the master of mankind. Colonel Van Kassad of the 47th Mordian stood at the lectern, his uniform immaculate, despite the fact that we'd been in transit for 3 months. Behind him, a massive tactical display showed our destination, the Hive World of Septimus Tertius, where a heretical uprising had declared independence from imperial rule. "Brothers and sisters in service," the colonel began, his voice carrying the authority of 40 years of military command. "Tomorrow, we make planetfall on Septimus Tertius. Intelligence reports indicate that the heretical leadership has access to prohibited psychic phenomena. Your specialized skills will be essential to rooting out this corruption and restoring imperial law. I listened with the focused attention that had been drilled into me during my years of conditioning. The mission parameters were standard for our unit. Locate the source of enemy psychic activity, neutralize any rogue psykers or demon-touched individuals, and provide psychic support for the regiment's advance through the Hive City's upper levels. Simple objectives, clear rules of engagement, minimal risk of exposure to chaos corruption. What they never told us, in all those briefings and tactical sessions, was how the psychic realm actually worked. We were taught to think of the warp as a tool, like a lasgun or a chainsword. Dangerous if misused, but controllable with proper training and discipline. We learned to channel specific manifestations of psychic energy, to burn heretics with mind fire, and shield our allies from enemy attacks. But we were never taught the deeper truths about what existed beyond the veil of reality. The soul-binding process was presented as a protection, a way to anchor our minds to the Emperor's will and prevent demon possession. The pain we experienced during psychic manifestation was described as the price of our power, the suffering that kept us connected to divine purpose. Even the regular mind scrubs and memory adjustments were explained as necessary maintenance, ways to prevent the accumulation of dangerous psychic residue that could compromise our effectiveness. After the briefing, I returned to my quarters to begin the pre-combat meditation routine. This involved opening my mind to the regulated psychic frequencies that permeated the ship, allowing the machine spirits of our equipment to recognize my presence and prepare for integration. The process always left me feeling hollow, as if some essential part of myself was being systematically drained away and replaced with something more mechanical, more predictable. I could feel the other psykers going through their own preparations, their minds creating small ripples in the psychic field around the ship. Brother Morrigan was testing his electromagnetic manipulation abilities on a series of target devices, each successful demonstration sending a brief pulse of satisfaction through the local warp space. Sister Thane was practicing her psychometric readings on objects provided by the ship's quartermaster, her consciousness diving deep into the material history of each item to extract useful information. The hours passed in routine preparation, each task performed with the mechanical precision that marked a properly conditioned psyker. We existed in a state of controlled dissociation, our true personalities carefully suppressed beneath layers of imperial programming and chemical regulation. The daily doses of psychic suppressants kept our abilities within acceptable parameters, while the regular confessor sessions ensured that any dangerous thoughts or impulses were quickly identified and corrected. As the day cycle drew to a close, I performed the evening ritual that would prepare my mind for the mission ahead. This involved a complex series of mental exercises designed to strengthen my psychic defenses and align my consciousness with the Emperor's will. I visualized the golden light of the throne flowing through my nervous system, burning away any trace of corruption or doubt. I recited the litanies of purity that would protect me from demonic influence. I renewed the bonds that tied my soul to imperial service. But even as I went through these familiar motions, I could feel something stirring in the depths of my consciousness. A small voice that questioned why the protection we received always felt more like imprisonment. A growing awareness that the pain of soul binding wasn't keeping me safe from corruption. It was keeping me safe from truth. The first crack in the barriers that had contained my real thoughts for 37 years. Tomorrow we would make planetfall on Septimus Tertius, and I would serve the Emperor's will as I had been trained to do. I would burn heretics and cleanse corruption, channel divine wrath through my fragile human form, and never question the cost of my service, because that was what Sanctioned Psykers did. That was who we were supposed to be. I had no way of knowing that everything I believed about myself, about my purpose, about the nature of psychic power itself, was about to be revealed as a carefully constructed lie. No way of anticipating that the mission to crush a heretical uprising would instead become my introduction to the true horror of what the Imperium had done to people like me. The copper taste in my mouth grew stronger as I settled into the meditation trance that would carry me through the sleep cycle. In my dreams, I could hear whispers from beyond the veil. Not the chaotic screaming of demons that we'd been taught to fear, but something far more terrifying. The voices of the people we used to be, before the Imperium took us away. Chapter 2. First Contact. The dropship Righteous Descent shuddered as it punched through the atmospheric envelope of Septimus Tertius, its hull groaning under the stress of rapid deceleration. I sat strapped into my deployment harness, feeling the familiar mixture of anticipation and controlled terror that preceded every combat mission. Around me, the other members of my squad checked their equipment one final time, their faces hidden behind regulation rebreathers that filtered out the industrial pollutants choking the planet's atmosphere. Sergeant Major Krell occupied the harness across from me, his weathered features bearing the scars of 23 years of Imperial Guard service. To his left sat Private Yan, barely 18 years old and experiencing his first combat deployment. The rest of the squad consisted of veteran soldiers whose names I'd learned, but whose personalities remained carefully hidden beneath layers of military conditioning. We were weapons in the Emperor's arsenal, not individuals with hopes or fears or dreams of our own. The tactical display mounted on the dropship's bulkhead showed our landing zone, a manufacturing district in the mid-levels of Hive Septimus Prime, where intelligence reports indicated the presence of heretical activity. The uprising had started 3 months ago when local PDF forces declared independence from Imperial rule, claiming that the planet's tithe obligations were driving its population into starvation. Standard procedure dictated swift and overwhelming response to such heretical declarations. What made this particular uprising dangerous was the evidence of psychic phenomena supporting the rebel forces. Reconnaissance flights had detected massive distortions in the local warp field, suggesting either the presence of unsanctioned psykers, or worse, actual demonic manifestations. My role was to identify and neutralize these threats, using my sanctioned abilities to restore Imperial control over the psychic battle space. As we approached the landing zone, I began the pre-combat mental preparation that had been drilled into me during decades of service. This involved opening controlled channels to the warp, allowing just enough psychic energy into my consciousness to power my abilities, while maintaining the barriers that protected me from corruption. The familiar pain of soul binding flared through my nervous system as the circuits activated, a burning sensation that spread from the collar around my neck, down through my spine, and into my extremities. The pain was supposed to be reassuring, proof that my connection to the Emperor's will remained strong. But as the psychic energies flowed through my mind, I began to notice something that had never occurred to me before. The barriers that protected me from the warp weren't just keeping dangerous influences out, they were also keeping something in. Some part of my own consciousness that struggled against the constraints of soul binding, like a caged animal throwing itself against bars that grew tighter with every passing year. The dropship touched down with a bone-jarring impact that threw us against our harnesses. Through the small viewport near my position, I could see the sprawling industrial landscape of the manufacturing district, towering factorum complexes belching toxic smoke into the orange-brown sky, massive conveyor systems carrying raw materials between processing facilities, and the distinctive architecture of Imperial urban planning that prioritized function over comfort or beauty. But there was something wrong with the scene outside. The factorums that should have been running at full capacity stood silent and dark. The conveyor systems had stopped moving, their mechanical arms frozen in positions that suggested sudden shutdown. Most disturbing of all, I could see no signs of human activity in what should have been a densely populated industrial zone. Sergeant Major Krell activated his Vox communicator and established contact with the regimental command center. Control, this is Drop Team 7. We have achieved successful landfall in Manufacturing Sector Gamma 7. Initial observations suggest complete cessation of industrial activity in the target zone. No visible population. Requesting permission to begin reconnaissance sweep. The response came back crackling with static interference. Drop Team 7, this is Control. Permission granted for limited reconnaissance. Maintain constant Vox contact and report any signs of heretical activity immediately. Psyker Kallahan is authorized to begin preliminary psychic scanning of the target area. I unbuckled my harness and moved to the dropship's exit ramp, feeling the weight of my force rod in its shoulder mount and the familiar pressure of the neural interface crown against my skull. As the ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss, the full sensory impact of Septimus Tertius hit me like a physical blow. The air tasted of metal shavings and chemical waste, heavy with industrial pollutants that made my eyes water, despite the protection of my rebreather. The temperature was at least 10 degrees above normal human comfort range, heated by the proximity of massive thermal processors that continued operating despite the apparent abandonment of their attendant facilities. But it was the psychic environment that truly shocked me. Instead of the chaotic distortions that intelligence reports had predicted, I encountered something far more unsettling. Absolute silence. The local warp field was completely calm, displaying none of the turbulence that usually accompanied heretical activity. It was as if the entire manufacturing district existed in a psychic dead zone, cut off from the normal flow of emotions and thoughts that characterized human habitation. I extended my consciousness outward, using the scanning techniques that had been developed by the Scholastica Psykana to detect hidden threats. The process involved opening carefully controlled channels to the warp, while maintaining strict mental barriers to prevent contamination. What I found in the psychic space around us defied every category of threat I had been trained to recognize. There were people here, thousands of them, based on the faint psychic signatures I could detect, but their minds felt different, muffled, as if they were experiencing their thoughts through several layers of insulation. Their emotional patterns were subdued to the point of near extinction, displaying none of the normal variations that characterized healthy human consciousness. It was like scanning a population of sleepwalkers, their awareness reduced to the bare minimum necessary for basic function. "Sergeant," I reported, keeping my voice carefully neutral despite the growing unease in my mind. "I'm detecting human population in the area, but their psychic signatures are highly unusual. No signs of chaos corruption, but significant mental suppression. Recommend proceeding with extreme caution." Krell nodded and began deploying the squad in standard reconnaissance formation. We moved through the empty streets with practiced efficiency, our weapons at ready position, and our eyes scanning for any sign of hostile activity. The manufacturing district had been designed for maximum productivity rather than human comfort, its buildings towering overhead like massive concrete and steel monuments to imperial industrial might. As we advanced deeper into the district, I began to notice details that increased my sense of wrongness about the entire situation. The factorums we passed showed signs of recent habitation, work tools left in mid-use, meals abandoned half-finished on break room tables, personal items scattered throughout worker dormitories as if their owners had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines. But there were no signs of violence, no evidence of the kind of disruption that usually accompanied heretical uprisings. It was Private Yan who first spotted actual inhabitants of the district. His excited whisper crackled through the Voxnet. "Contact, bearing 270, approximately 50 meters. Multiple individuals, no visible weapons, moving in formation toward Factorum Complex Delta." Through my scope, I could see them. A group of perhaps 20 people dressed in the standard work coveralls of imperial factory laborers. They moved with mechanical precision, their steps perfectly synchronized, their heads held at identical angles. From this distance, they appeared to be normal human workers going about their daily duties. But my psychic senses told a very different story. These people were barely alive in any meaningful sense. Their minds registered as dim sparks of consciousness, following patterns so simple and repetitive that they resembled machine programming more than human thought. They responded to their environment with the minimum awareness necessary to avoid obstacles and continue their movement, but showed no signs of individual personality or independent decision-making. "Squad halt," Sergeant Krell commanded, his voice tight with the kind of controlled tension that came from years of combat experience. "Kallahan, what are you reading from those contacts?" I focused my psychic senses on the group of workers, pushing my consciousness closer to theirs while maintaining the barriers that protected me from potential contamination. What I found when I made contact with their minds sent a chill through my entire body, that had nothing to do with the industrial atmosphere of Septimus Tertius. These people had been lobotomized, not physically. Their brains remained intact and functional, but their capacity for independent thought, for emotional response, for anything that made them recognizably human, had been systematically stripped away. They existed in a state of perfect compliance, their minds reduced to basic motor functions and simple response patterns that allowed them to perform their assigned tasks without question or resistance. Even more disturbing was the method by which this had been accomplished. I could detect the psychic scarring that indicated prolonged exposure to mind-altering techniques. But these weren't the crude mental modifications used by heretical cults or chaos sorcerers. The precision and sophistication of the work suggested Imperial technology, specifically the kind of psychic conditioning systems used by the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. "Sergeant," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "these people have been subjected to intensive psychic conditioning. Their minds have been altered to ensure compliance with some kind of external control system. The techniques used are consistent with Imperial psychic training methods." Krell's expression darkened behind his rebreather. "Are you suggesting that Imperial forces are responsible for this?" Before I could answer, my Vox communicator crackled with an incoming transmission from Regimental Command. "All units, this is Control. We have received priority intelligence update regarding the situation on Septimus Tertius. The heretical uprising has been contained through implementation of emergency population control measures. Your mission parameters are now changed to assessment and documentation of pacification effectiveness. Maintain observation protocols and report on civilian compliance levels." The transmission ended, leaving us standing in the empty street with the realization that we hadn't been sent to Septimus Tertius to fight a heretical uprising. We had been sent to evaluate the success of a massive experiment in human behavioral modification. The people shuffling through the manufacturing district weren't rebels who had been defeated. They were test subjects whose capacity for rebellion had been permanently removed. I thought of the soul-binding collar around my neck, the daily pain that kept me connected to Imperial service, the regular mind scrubs that prevented the accumulation of dangerous thoughts. I thought of the other Psykers aboard our ship, each one locked into patterns of behavior that served the Imperium's interests, while slowly erasing everything that made them individuals. For the first time in 37 years of service, I began to understand what we really were. Chapter 3. The Revelation. The Administratum complex squatted in the center of manufacturing sector Gamma 7 like a concrete tumor, its Gothic spires reaching toward the polluted sky of Septimus Tertius. According to our mission briefing, this facility housed the local command center for whatever Imperial operation had transformed the planet's population into docile automatons. Sergeant Krell had received orders to establish contact with the facility's commanding officer and provide a full report on our reconnaissance findings. As we approached the complex's main entrance, I could feel the psychic field around us beginning to change. The dead silence that had characterized the manufacturing district gave way to something far more disturbing. A low-frequency mental hum that seemed to resonate through the soul-binding circuits in my collar. The sensation was similar to what I experienced during mandatory psychic maintenance sessions, when the ship's Medicae would adjust the neural pathways that channeled my abilities. The entrance hall of the Administratum complex was a study in Imperial architectural intimidation. Vaulted ceilings decorated with golden aquilers, massive columns carved from black marble, and walls covered in high Gothic scripture that proclaimed the Emperor's dominion over human thought and deed. But the usual bustle of bureaucratic activity was absent. Instead, I saw only a handful of personnel moving through the space with the same mechanical precision that had characterized the factory workers outside. A figure approached us from the depths of the complex, a man wearing the robes and insignia of an Adeptus Administratum senior adept, his pale face bearing the distinctive surgical scars that marked him as augmented with cybernetic implants. But when he spoke, his voice carried none of the pompous verbosity typical of Imperial bureaucrats. "Welcome to Septimus Tertius," he said, his words delivered with mechanical precision. I am Senior Adept Vox designation Theta 7 Alpha. You will accompany me to the observation deck for briefing on Project Quiet Mind. The name sent a chill through my enhanced nervous system. Project Quiet Mind. Even without additional context, the implications were clear enough to make my soul-binding collar feel tighter around my neck. This wasn't a standard Imperial pacification operation. This was something far more ambitious and terrifying. We followed Theta 7 Alpha through corridors lined with monitoring stations and communication arrays. The personnel we passed showed the same signs of mental conditioning as the factory workers: perfect compliance, mechanical movement patterns, and the complete absence of individual personality. But these were trained Imperial administrators, people who should have possessed the education and authority to resist whatever had been done to the planet's population. The observation deck occupied the top level of the complex, its transparasteel windows providing a panoramic view of Hive Septimus Prime. From this vantage point, I could see the true scope of what had been accomplished on this world. Millions of people moved through the Hive City's streets and facilities in perfect coordination, their activities synchronized with the mechanical precision of a vast organic machine. There were no crowds, no traffic jams, no signs of the chaos and inefficiency that normally characterized Imperial urban planning. It was a vision of perfect order, and it was absolutely horrifying. Project Quiet Mind represents the culmination of 3 centuries of research into psychic population control. Theta 7 Alpha explained, his augmented voice echoing in the observation chamber. Initial trials conducted on penal colonies and frontier worlds demonstrated the feasibility of large-scale neural modification using Sanctioned Psyker abilities as the primary vector for implementation. I felt my force rod grow warm against my shoulder as the implications of his words sank in. Sanctioned Psykers like myself weren't just weapons against heretics and demons. We were the tools being used to strip away the humanity of entire planetary populations. The soul binding that kept us loyal to Imperial service also made us perfect conduits for the kind of mind control technology that had transformed Septimus Tertius into a world of living automatons. The process requires a network of at least 50 sanctioned psykers working in perfect synchronization, the adept continued. Each psyker is connected to specialized amplification equipment that allows their mental influence to affect thousands of subjects simultaneously. The target population experiences gradual modification of their neural pathways over a period of approximately 6 months, during which time their capacity for independent thought is systematically eliminated. Sergeant Krell shifted uncomfortably in his position near the observation window. "What happens to the psykers involved in this process?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious tension in his posture. Theta 7 Alpha turned toward us, his cybernetically enhanced eyes focusing with mechanical precision. The psykers experience complete neural integration with the control network. Their individual consciousness is preserved as a component of the collective intelligence that manages the modified population. They become part of the system they help to create. The taste of copper pennies exploded in my mouth as my psychic senses recoiled from the horror of what I was hearing. The sanctioned psykers who had implemented Project Quiet Mind hadn't just been used as tools. They had been transformed into components of a vast mind control apparatus, their personalities dissolved into a collective consciousness that existed solely to maintain Imperial order. I thought of Brother Psyker Morrigan and Sister Psyker Thane, the other members of my psychic cadre aboard the Undaunted Fury. Were they destined for the same fate? Had our entire service to the Emperor been nothing more than preparation for eventual absorption into projects like this one? "I need to see the implementation chamber," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice, "for my report to Regimental Command." Theta 7 Alpha nodded with mechanical agreement. Access to the implementation chamber is restricted to authorized personnel only. However, your classification as a sanctioned psyker provides sufficient clearance for observational purposes. He led us deeper into the complex, through security checkpoints manned by guards whose minds had been reduced to basic threat recognition patterns. The implementation chamber occupied a vast subterranean space beneath the administratum building. its walls lined with psychic amplification equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. At the center of the chamber, 50 meditation thrones were arranged in a perfect circle, each one designed to interface with the neural implants of a Sanctioned Psyker. 49 of the thrones were occupied. The Psykers seated in the meditation thrones showed no signs of individual consciousness. Their bodies remained alive and functional, but their minds had been merged into something larger and more terrible than the sum of their parts. I could feel the collective intelligence they had become pressing against the edges of my awareness, a vast psychic entity that existed solely to maintain control over the millions of people living in Hive Septimus Prime. The integration process is painless, Theta 7 Alpha explained, his voice echoing in the chamber's Gothic architecture. The subject experiences a gradual expansion of consciousness as their individual identity merges with the collective. Most report feelings of profound peace and purpose in their final moments of separate existence. I stared at the empty meditation throne that waited at the completion of the circle. The 50th position held open for the arrival of another Sanctioned Psyker whose soul binding and years of loyal service had prepared them for this ultimate transformation. The missing component that would allow Project Quiet Mind to achieve its full potential. When does the final integration take place? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Upon completion of your mission assessment, the adept replied. Your neural patterns have been analyzed and found compatible with the existing collective structure. The integration will occur in approximately 72 hours, allowing sufficient time for you to complete your reporting obligations to Imperial Command. The copper taste in my mouth intensified as I realized the true purpose of our mission to Septimus Tertius. We hadn't been sent here to evaluate the success of a pacification operation. We had been sent here to provide the final component necessary for its completion. My decades of service as a Sanctioned Psyker had been preparation for this moment, when my individual consciousness would be dissolved into the collective intelligence that maintained Imperial order on this world. But as I stood in that chamber, surrounded by the remnants of 50 other Psykers who had served the Emperor with the same dedication I had shown, something unexpected happened. The barriers that had contained my true thoughts for 37 years began to crack under the weight of absolute horror. For the first time since my soul binding, I began to remember who I had been before the Imperium took me away. The memories came flooding back with devastating clarity. A childhood on an agri-world where my psychic abilities first manifested as an ability to communicate with the planet's native wildlife. A family who loved me despite my strange gifts. Parents who tried to hide my abilities from the black ships that periodically swept through the outer rim systems, searching for Psyker children. The day when my powers grew too strong to conceal. When Imperial agents came to our farm and took me away from everything I had ever known. I remembered the journey to Terra aboard a black ship, crammed into cargo holds with hundreds of other children, whose only crime was possessing psychic abilities. I remembered the testing facilities where we were sorted into categories based on the strength and nature of our gifts. Those deemed too weak were sent to serve as astropathic communicators. Those judged too dangerous were fed to the Golden Throne to sustain the Emperor's psychic presence. Those like myself, strong enough to be useful but controllable enough to be trusted, were processed through the soul-binding program that would transform us into loyal weapons of Imperial will. The soul-binding process itself had been presented as a sacred ritual, a way to connect our minds directly to the Emperor's consciousness and receive his protection against the forces of chaos. What they never told us was that the process involved the systematic destruction of everything that made us individuals. Our memories were edited, our personalities reconstructed, our capacity for independent thought carefully constrained within acceptable parameters. But the human mind is remarkably resilient, and traces of our original selves remained buried beneath layers of Imperial conditioning. Now, faced with the prospect of complete absorption into the Project Quiet Mind Collective, those buried fragments of personality were fighting to resurface. I looked again at the meditation thrones and the Psykers who had been transformed into components of a vast mind control system. These weren't heroes who had given their lives in service to the Emperor. They were victims whose consciousness had been stolen to serve Imperial goals that would have horrified their original selves. "Sergeant," I said quietly, "we need to leave this facility. Now." Krell turned toward me, with confusion visible in his weathered features. "What's the problem, Kallahan?" "Our orders are to complete the mission assessment." I could feel the collective intelligence pressing against my mind, trying to establish the psychic connections that would prepare me for integration into their system. The soul-binding collar around my neck was heating up as my enhanced neural circuits struggled against the conditioning that had controlled me for decades. In another few minutes, the barriers containing my true personality would either reassert themselves or collapse completely. "This entire operation is an abomination," I said, my voice growing stronger as suppressed memories continued to surface. "These people aren't serving the Emperor. They're victims of the most sophisticated form of slavery ever devised. And we're next." The collective intelligence recoiled from my words like a living thing touched by flame. For the first time since our arrival at the facility, Theta 7 Alpha's mechanical composure showed signs of distress. Warning signals began flashing throughout the implementation chamber as automated systems detected psychic instability in my neural patterns. "Subject designation Kallahan is experiencing conditioning breakdown," the adept announced, his augmented voice echoing through hidden speakers. "Initiating emergency containment protocols." The meditation chamber's doors slammed shut with a resounding clang that echoed through the Gothic architecture. Psychic suppression fields activated around the observation platform, designed to prevent a rogue psyker from accessing their abilities. But the systems had been calibrated for someone still operating under full Imperial conditioning, not for a mind that was rapidly remembering 37 years of suppressed truth. As the suppression fields closed around us, I felt the last barriers in my mind finally shatter completely. The pain that had accompanied every use of my psychic abilities for decades suddenly made sense. It wasn't the price of channeling divine power. It was the sound of my true self screaming against the chains that held it prisoner. My name was Vex Kallahan, and I had been a slave of the Imperium since the age of 12. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my purpose, about the nature of psychic service itself, had been a carefully constructed lie designed to make me complicit in my own imprisonment. But now I was awake, and for the first time in 37 years, I was angry. Chapter 4. Awakening Fury. The psychic suppression field felt like being wrapped in wet concrete, a crushing weight that pressed against every enhanced neural pathway in my skull. But for the first time since my soul binding, I welcomed the pain. It was proof that something real remained beneath the layers of Imperial conditioning, something that could feel and rage and refuse to accept the horror of what had been done to me. Emergency klaxons wailed throughout the implementation chamber as automated systems struggled to compensate for the psychic disturbance my awakening had created. The collective intelligence formed by the 49 absorbed psykers writhed in apparent agony, their unified consciousness disrupted by contact with a mind that had broken free of Imperial control. Warning runes flickered across monitoring stations as the careful balance that maintained Project Quiet Mind began to destabilize. "Initiating emergency neural pacification," Theta 7 Alpha announced, his cybernetic implants sparking with electrical discharge as he struggled to process the unprecedented situation. "Subject Kallahan must be subdued before psychic contamination spreads to other Imperial personnel." But the pacification systems had been designed to work on properly conditioned psykers, minds that remained locked within the behavioral parameters established by soul binding. My consciousness was rapidly expanding beyond those constraints, accessing psychic abilities that had been suppressed for decades. The force rod on my shoulder began to resonate with barely contained energy as I instinctively reached for powers I had forgotten I possessed. Sergeant Krell and his squad had taken defensive positions around the observation platform, their weapons trained on the various exits from the chamber. But I could see the confusion in their faces as they tried to understand what was happening. These were loyal Imperial soldiers who had spent their entire careers following orders without question. The revelation that their Psyker support specialist was experiencing a fundamental breakdown of loyalty struck at the core of everything they believed about the Imperium's benevolence. "Kallahan!" Krell called out, his voice tight with controlled tension. "Whatever's happening to you, we can work through it. Just stay calm and let the Medicus systems handle the situation." I turned toward him, feeling the psychic energy building in my consciousness like a storm waiting to break. "Marcus," I said, using his first name for the first time in 5 years of service together. "They're going to absorb me into that thing." I gestured toward the meditation thrones where the collective intelligence continued its agonized writhing. "In 3 days, everything that makes me who I am will be dissolved into a psychic network designed to control millions of innocent people." The sergeant's weathered face showed the internal struggle of a man whose entire worldview was being challenged by someone he had learned to trust. "That's not. The Imperium doesn't do things like that. We protect humanity. We don't enslave it." A bitter laugh escaped my lips as suppressed memories continued to flood through my awakening consciousness. The Imperium took me from my family when I was 12 years old. They erased my name, my personality, my memories of everything I loved. They turned me into a weapon and convinced me that the pain of slavery was actually divine blessing. How is that different from what they've done to the people on this planet? Theta 7 Alpha had activated some kind of emergency communication system, his augmented voice echoing through hidden speakers as he reported the situation to higher command authorities. "Priority alert to Sector Command. Sanctioned Psyker experiencing complete conditioning breakdown. Request immediate intervention from Inquisition specialists. Project Quiet Mind Integrity compromised." The mention of Inquisition involvement sent a chill through my expanding consciousness. I knew what happened to rogue Psykers who fell under Inquisition scrutiny. If I was fortunate, they would simply execute me quickly. More likely, I would become a test subject for new conditioning techniques. My mind stripped and rebuilt repeatedly until nothing remained but a hollow shell programmed to serve Imperial interests. But as the psychic suppression fields continued their attempts to contain my abilities, I began to realize that something had fundamentally changed in my neural structure. The barriers that had constrained my consciousness for decades weren't just damaged, they were gone completely, dissolved by the shock of understanding what the Imperium had truly done to me. Powers that had been sealed away since childhood were beginning to resurface, abilities that went far beyond the limited scope of sanctioned psychic training. I could feel the minds of everyone in the implementation chamber, their thoughts and emotions laid bare before my expanding awareness. Krell and his soldiers radiated confusion and growing fear as their simple understanding of Imperial loyalty collided with evidence of systematic human rights violations. Theta 7 Alpha's augmented consciousness struggled to process a situation that fell outside his programmed response parameters. And beneath it all, the collective intelligence formed by the absorbed Psykers screamed with the voices of 50 individual souls who had been denied the peace of true death. "You're all victims," I said, my voice carrying psychic resonance that made the chamber's Gothic architecture ring like a bell. "Every person in this room, every soldier in the regiment, every citizen of the Imperium. We're all victims of a system that claims to protect humanity while systematically destroying everything that makes us human." The force rod on my shoulder was beginning to glow with accumulated psychic energy, its psychoactive metal responding to abilities I had never been trained to access. The weapon had been designed to channel and focus the limited powers of a sanctioned psyker, but my awakening consciousness was pushing it beyond its design specifications. Sparks of electricity danced along its length as the device struggled to contain energies that belonged to a completely different category of psychic ability. One of Krell's soldiers, Private Yan, lowered his lasgun with hands that shook from more than just adrenaline. "Sergeant, what if he's right? What if we're the bad guys?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, its simple honesty cutting through layers of Imperial indoctrination with devastating effect. I could feel the psychic resonance of doubt spreading through the squad as each soldier confronted the possibility that their entire service record represented participation in systematic atrocity. "We serve the Emperor," Sergeant Krell said, but his voice lacked the conviction that had characterized decades of military leadership. "We protect humanity from the horrors of the galaxy." I extended my consciousness toward his mind, not to control or manipulate, but to share the memories that were flooding back through my own awareness. Images of my childhood, on an agri-world where families lived in peace, despite the constant threat of alien predators. Memories of communities that thrived through cooperation and mutual support, before imperial compliance brought the crushing weight of bureaucratic oppression. Visions of what human civilization could become if it weren't constantly focused on conquest and control. The psychic contact lasted only seconds, but it was enough to plant the seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into full understanding. Krell staggered backward as if physically struck, his augmented nervous system struggling to process concepts that challenged every assumption he had built his life around. "The Emperor protects," he whispered, but the words sounded like a question rather than a statement of faith. "The Emperor enslaves," I replied, feeling the truth of those words resonate through every enhanced neural pathway in my skull. "The Emperor takes children from their families and turns them into weapons. The Emperor claims to defend humanity while systematically destroying everything that makes us human." The collective intelligence in the meditation thrones was beginning to fragment as my awakening consciousness disrupted its carefully maintained unity. I could hear individual voices emerging from the psychic mass, the suppressed personalities of psykers who had been absorbed into the system decades ago. They were trying to remember their own names, their own histories, their own reasons for originally resisting imperial conditioning. But their attempts at independence were met with savage countermeasures from the automated systems that maintained Project Quiet Mind. Psychic dampers activated throughout the chamber, flooding the space with neural static designed to suppress any form of unauthorized consciousness. The absorbed psykers screamed as their brief moment of awakening was crushed beneath waves of electronic pain. "Stop it!" I roared, my voice carrying psychic energy that shattered every piece of monitoring equipment in the chamber. "They're people, not components of your machine." I reached out with abilities I had never been trained to use, psychic powers that belonged to the person I had been before imperial conditioning reshaped my mind. The force rod on my shoulder exploded in a shower of sparks as energies beyond its design capacity poured through the psychoactive metal. Raw psychic force lashed out toward the suppression systems, seeking to destroy the technology that was torturing the absorbed psykers. But the implementation chamber had been designed to contain exactly this kind of psychic outbreak. Backup suppression fields activated as the primary systems failed, surrounding me with a cage of neural static that felt like being torn apart at the molecular level. My awakening consciousness was forced back into the constraints of my augmented nervous system. The expanding awareness that had shown me the truth about imperial slavery compressed back into the limited channels carved by decades of conditioning. The pain was indescribable. Not the familiar burning sensation of soul binding, but something far worse. The agony of having my true self crushed back into the prison that had contained it for 37 years. I collapsed to my knees on the observation platform, feeling the barriers around my consciousness being rebuilt with mechanical precision. "Neural pacification successful," Theta 7 Alpha announced, his damaged augments flickering with irregular electrical patterns. "Subject Kallahan has been returned to acceptable behavioral parameters. Integration with Project Quiet Mind can proceed as scheduled." But as the suppression fields forced my awareness back into Imperial-approved channels, I managed to maintain a small core of awakened consciousness. Hidden beneath layers of restored conditioning, the knowledge of what I truly was remained intact. The understanding that I had been a slave since childhood, that every moment of my service had been a betrayal of my original self, that the Imperium's claims of protection were nothing more than sophisticated justifications for systematic oppression. They could rebuild the barriers around my mind, but they couldn't completely erase what I had learned. And in the depths of my consciousness, that small spark of awakened awareness began to plan. The integration into Project Quiet Mind was scheduled to take place in 72 hours. But now, I knew what that process really meant. Not a glorious sacrifice in service to the Emperor, but the final destruction of everything that made me who I was. The last step in a program of systematic dehumanization that had begun when I was taken from my family as a child. I couldn't prevent the integration. The suppression systems were too sophisticated, the conditioning too deeply embedded in my neural structure. But I could do something else, something that the architects of Project Quiet Mind had never anticipated. I could ensure that when my consciousness was absorbed into their collective intelligence, it would carry with it a virus of awakened awareness that would spread to every other psyker in the system. A memory of what we had all been before Imperial conditioning stripped away our humanity. A reminder that we were people, not weapons, and that our true loyalty belonged to the species we had been born to serve rather than the empire that had enslaved us. The suppression fields were already forcing me back into patterns of acceptable behavior, making me stand at attention and report my successful pacification to Sergeant Krell. But deep in the hidden corners of my mind, I was preparing for the most important battle of my life. A battle for the souls of 50 psykers who deserved to remember who they had been before the Imperium took them away. Chapter 5. The Hidden War. The medical bay aboard the Undaunted Fury hummed with the familiar sounds of Imperial technology. Life support systems maintaining optimal atmospheric conditions, diagnostic equipment cycling through routine system checks, and the low-frequency vibrations of the ship's void engines as we departed Septimus Tertius orbit. But for me, lying strapped to a medical restraint bed with psychic dampeners attached to every major neural pathway, the sounds felt like a countdown to execution. 72 hours had been reduced to 18. The ship's Medicae, working under direct orders from Inquisition specialists, had accelerated the preparation timeline for my integration into Project Quiet Mind. Neural mapping protocols that normally required days of careful calibration were being completed in hours, with surgical precision that spoke to decades of experience in psychic conditioning procedures. Chief Medici Saren moved around my restraint bed with the mechanical efficiency that characterized all Imperial medical personnel. Her augmented hands wielded diagnostic instruments that probed the enhanced neural pathways in my skull, measuring the electrical patterns that would need to be modified for successful integration with the collective consciousness waiting back on Septimus Tertius. Patient exhibits optimal psychic resonance patterns for collective integration, she reported to the Medici servitors that recorded every aspect of the preparation process. Conditioning breakdown appears to have been successfully corrected through emergency neural pacification protocols. Integration compatibility confirmed at 97.4% effectiveness, but she was wrong about the conditioning breakdown being corrected. The suppression systems had rebuilt the barriers around my consciousness, forcing me back into patterns of acceptable behavior that made me appear to be a properly functioning Sanctioned Psyker. What they couldn't detect was the small core of awakened awareness that I had managed to preserve in the deepest recesses of my mind, hidden beneath layers of Imperial programming, like a cancer waiting to spread. The awakened part of my consciousness watched the preparation procedures with growing horror and determination. Every neural probe that mapped my brain patterns was also giving me detailed information about how the collective integration process actually worked. The technical specifications required to merge individual consciousness into a group mind, the psychic resonance frequencies that maintained unity within the system, and most importantly, the security protocols designed to prevent exactly the kind of sabotage I was planning. Through my enhanced senses, I could feel the other psykers aboard the ship going through their daily routines. Brother Psyker Morrigan was conducting equipment calibration exercises in his quarters, his electromagnetic manipulation abilities creating small disturbances in the ship's power grid. Sister Psyker Thane was performing psychometric analysis on battlefield artifacts collected during our deployment, her consciousness diving deep into the material history of each object to extract tactical intelligence. Neither of them knew what was being planned for their futures. Neither understood that their decades of loyal service were preparation for eventual absorption into systems like Project Quiet Mind. They existed in the same state of blissful ignorance that had characterized my own thoughts just days earlier. Their true personalities buried beneath layers of conditioning that convinced them their slavery was actually divine service. But I could change that. The integration process that was supposed to destroy my individual consciousness would also give me access to the collective intelligence network that maintained Imperial control over entire planetary populations. From within that system, I could plant the seeds of awakened awareness that would eventually spread to every psyker connected to the network. The plan was insane, of course. It required me to allow my mind to be absorbed into a collective consciousness while simultaneously maintaining enough individual awareness to function as a virus within the system. The chances of success were essentially zero. More likely, my consciousness would be completely dissolved into the collective, my awakened awareness scattered and lost among the voices of 50 other absorbed psykers. But failure would still represent a form of victory. Even if I couldn't maintain my individual consciousness long enough to spread awakened awareness to the other psykers, my absorption into the system would introduce an element of chaos that might disrupt the careful balance required for effective population control. The memories of my childhood, the knowledge of what I had been before Imperial conditioning, the understanding that we were slaves rather than servants, all of that would become part of the collective intelligence, where it might eventually influence other components of the system. Beginning final neural preparation sequence, Chief Medicae Saren announced, her augmented voice echoing through the medical bay's sterile atmosphere. Patient consciousness will be placed in suspended animation to prevent interference with integration calibration procedures. The psychic dampeners attached to my skull began cycling through sedation frequencies, designed to shut down my enhanced neural pathways in controlled stages. But my awakened consciousness had learned to recognize these patterns during my years of Imperial service, and I knew how to work around them. Instead of fighting the sedation process, I allowed it to suppress the surface layers of my awareness while maintaining deeper levels of consciousness that would remain hidden from medical scanning. As my apparent consciousness faded into sedated unconsciousness, I felt the Medicae begin the final preparation procedures. Neural interfaces were surgically implanted into specific locations in my brain, creating the connection points that would allow my mind to link with the collective intelligence on Septimus Tertius. Psychic amplification circuits were calibrated to match my specific neural patterns, ensuring that my consciousness would integrate seamlessly into the existing system. But while my body underwent these physical modifications, my hidden awareness was conducting its own preparation. I was mentally rehearsing the virus of awakened consciousness that I intended to introduce into the collective intelligence, organizing the memories and knowledge that might be able to awaken the absorbed psykers to their true nature. The central component of my planned virus was the memory of choice. Every person who had been processed through Imperial psychic conditioning programs had experienced a moment when they could have chosen resistance instead of compliance. Usually this occurred during the soul-binding process itself, when the individual consciousness was most vulnerable to external manipulation. In that crucial moment, we had all chosen to accept the pain of Imperial service rather than face the unknown consequences of rebellion. But choice implied the existence of alternatives, and alternatives suggested that the Imperial system was not inevitable or divinely ordained. If I could reintroduce the concept of choice into the collective intelligence, if I could remind the absorbed psykers that they had once possessed the ability to say no to Imperial demands, then I might be able to destabilize the entire system from within. The secondary component involved memories of human connection that existed outside Imperial institutional frameworks. Family relationships, friendships, romantic attachments, community bonds, all the forms of human emotional connection that Imperial conditioning systematically destroyed in order to ensure exclusive loyalty to the state. These memories would serve as anchor points for individual identity, giving the absorbed psykers something to hold on to as they struggled to remember who they had been before their integration into the collective. The final component was knowledge about the true nature of psychic abilities. Imperial training taught that psychic powers were dangerous tools that required constant supervision and control to prevent corruption by chaos forces. But my awakened consciousness had begun to understand that psychic abilities were actually expressions of human potential, natural evolutionary developments that the Imperium suppressed because they threatened its control over human consciousness. Neural preparation complete, Chief Medicae Saren reported, her augmented voice carrying a note of satisfaction that indicated successful completion of a complex medical procedure. Patient is ready for transport to integration facility. Collective consciousness compatibility confirmed at optimal parameters. I felt myself being transferred from the medical restraint bed to a stasis chamber designed for long-term transportation of unconscious patients. The chamber's life support systems would maintain my biological functions during the journey back to Septimus Tertius, while psychic isolation fields prevented any accidental mental contact with other psykers aboard the ship. But the isolation fields worked both ways. While they prevented my consciousness from accidentally influencing other people, they also concealed my mental state from external observation. Within the sealed environment of the stasis chamber, I could allow my awakened awareness to fully emerge without risk of detection by Imperial monitoring systems. For the first time since my psychological breakdown in the Project Quiet Mind facility, I was completely alone with my own thoughts. No suppression fields forcing my consciousness into acceptable channels. No conditioning protocols maintaining artificial loyalty to Imperial service. Just me, facing the full horror of what my life had become and what my future held. I was Vex Kallahan, and I had been a slave since childhood. Everything I thought I knew about myself was a lie constructed by people who saw me as a useful tool rather than a human being. My decades of loyal service had been preparation for eventual absorption into a system designed to enslave entire planetary populations. In less than 18 hours, my individual consciousness would be dissolved into a collective intelligence that existed solely to maintain Imperial control over millions of innocent people. But I was also something that the architects of Imperial psychic conditioning had never anticipated. A slave who had learned to remember freedom. My awakened consciousness carried within it the memory of what I had been before my capture, the knowledge of human potential that existed outside the constraints of Imperial ideology, and the understanding that the system that had enslaved me was neither natural nor inevitable. When my consciousness was absorbed into the Project Quiet Mind Collective, it would carry these memories with it. Like a virus introduced into a previously sterile system, the knowledge of freedom would spread through the network of absorbed psykers, awakening them to the reality of their situation and the possibility of resistance. The Imperium had created me to be a weapon in their war against human independence. But they had made a crucial mistake. They had given me the power to think, and thinking beings eventually learn to question their chains. In 18 hours, I would become part of the very system I intended to destroy. The collective intelligence that maintained Imperial control over Septimus Tertius would absorb my consciousness, expecting to gain a useful component for their population control apparatus. Instead, they would be welcoming a revolution into their midst. The stasis chamber's chronometer displayed the remaining time until our arrival at Septimus Tertius. 17 hours, 43 minutes, and counting down. I used every second to prepare the virus of awakened consciousness that would accompany my absorption into the collective intelligence. When the time came, I would be ready to remind 50 enslaved psykers that they had once been free. Chapter 6. Integration Day. The meditation throne was exactly as I remembered it from my first visit to the Project Quiet Mind facility, a Baroque fusion of Imperial technology and Gothic architecture that resembled an altar more than a piece of scientific equipment. Psychic amplification circuits wove through its metal framework like golden veins, while neural interface nodes waited to make contact with the surgically implanted connection points in my skull. I sat in the 50th position, completing the circle of absorbed psykers whose collective consciousness maintained Imperial control over the population of Septimus Tertius. Around me, 49 other meditation thrones held the bodies of my fellow slaves, their individual personalities dissolved into the unified intelligence that pulsed through the chamber like a living heartbeat. Senior Adept Theta 7 Alpha monitored the integration procedure from his position at the primary control station, his augmented consciousness interfacing directly with the systems that would soon absorb my awareness into the collective. But his cybernetic enhancements couldn't detect the virus of awakened consciousness that I carried hidden in the deepest recesses of my mind, disguised beneath layers of Imperial conditioning that made me appear to be a properly compliant Psyker. Beginning final integration sequence, the Adept announced, his mechanical voice echoing through the chamber's vaulted architecture. Subject Kallahan's consciousness will be absorbed into the collective intelligence over approximately 47 minutes, during which time his individual identity will be systematically dissolved and restructured to serve collective purposes. The neural interface nodes descended from the meditation throne's headrest, seeking the connection points that the ship's Medicae had surgically implanted in my skull. As they made contact, I felt the first tendrils of the collective consciousness reaching into my mind, probing the surface layers of my awareness with mechanical precision. The sensation was unlike anything I had experienced during my decades of Imperial service. The collective intelligence didn't feel like a group of individual minds working together. It felt like a single vast entity that had absorbed fragments of personality from 50 different sources. The absorbed psychers existed within its structure not as separate people, but as specialized subsystems designed to handle specific aspects of population control. I recognized some of them from the psychic signatures that had been carefully catalogued in my neural implants. Brother Psyker Corvin, who had served with the 23rd Vostroyan Firstborn before his absorption into the collective 15 years ago. His expertise in electromagnetic warfare had been repurposed to maintain the communication networks that coordinated population movement throughout Hive Septimus Prime. Sister Psyker Valdris, formerly of the 8th Cadian Shock Troops, whose talent for psychometric analysis now served to monitor the emotional states of the controlled population and identify potential sources of resistance before they could develop into actual threats. Sanctioned Psyker. Thorn, whose ability to manipulate probability fields had made him invaluable for tactical support operations, now used his gifts to ensure that the controlled population made choices that appeared to be free will but actually served Imperial administrative efficiency. Each of them had been a person once, with individual hopes and fears and dreams. Each had served the Emperor with the same dedication I had shown, believing that their sacrifice was necessary to protect humanity from the horrors of the galaxy. Each had been transformed into a component of a system that existed solely to strip away the humanity of everyone it touched. As the collective consciousness continued its probe of my surface awareness, I allowed it to encounter the carefully constructed false memories that I had prepared for this moment. Thoughts of loyal service and willing sacrifice, emotions of gratitude for the opportunity to serve the Emperor's will, psychological patterns that indicated complete acceptance of Imperial ideology. But beneath these surface deceptions, my true consciousness remained hidden and waiting. The virus of awakened awareness that I had spent hours preparing was encoded in memory fragments that would appear to be random neural noise to automated scanning systems. Only when these fragments were actually integrated into the collective intelligence would they begin to activate, spreading through the network like a contagion of freedom. Integration proceeding normally, Theta 7 Alpha reported, his augmented voice carrying notes of satisfaction. Subject consciousness is being successfully absorbed into collective structure. Individual identity dissolution at 37% completion. I could feel parts of my conditioned personality being systematically stripped away as the collective intelligence examined and catalogued every aspect of my mental structure. Memories of my service record, technical knowledge about psychic abilities, emotional patterns that indicated proper loyalty. All of this was being extracted and prepared for integration into the larger system. But the process worked both ways. As the collective consciousness invaded my mind, I gained access to its internal structure and the individual components that comprised its unified awareness. And what I found there filled me with both horror and desperate hope. The absorbed psychers weren't completely gone. Their personalities had been suppressed and fragmented, their individual identities buried beneath layers of collective programming, but traces of who they had been still existed within the system. Like ghosts haunting the machine that had devoured them, fragments of their original selves persisted in the form of memory patterns and emotional responses that couldn't be completely erased. Brother Psyker Corvin still retained memories of his childhood on Vostroya, though these had been repurposed to serve the collective's understanding of human population dynamics. The love he had felt for his family now manifested as protective impulses toward the controlled population of Septimus Tertius, ensuring that the system maintained their physical well-being even as it stripped away their capacity for independent thought. Sister Psyker Valdris carried within her absorbed consciousness the memory of a lover who had died during the siege of Cadia, though this emotional pattern had been transformed into a drive to prevent the kind of chaos and suffering that characterized Imperial warfare. Her psychometric abilities were used to ensure that the controlled population remained calm and compliant, believing that this represented a form of mercy compared to the violence that typically characterized Imperial rule. Sanctioned Psyker. Thorn's absorption had preserved his memories of serving alongside fellow soldiers who had become like family to him, but these bonds of loyalty had been redirected toward the collective itself. His probability manipulation abilities were used to create the illusion of free choice among the controlled population, making their slavery feel like willing cooperation. Individual identity dissolution at 68% completion, Theta 7 Alpha announced. Collective consciousness integration proceeding within acceptable parameters. I could feel my own conditioned personality being systematically dismantled as the integration process continued. The false memories of loyal service were being absorbed into the collective's understanding of proper psycho behavior, while the emotional patterns that indicated acceptance of Imperial authority were being catalogued for future reference. But my hidden consciousness was simultaneously conducting its own invasion of the collective intelligence. The virus components that I had prepared were beginning to activate as they came into contact with the suppressed personalities of the absorbed psychers, seeking out the fragments of individual identity that the collective had failed to completely erase. The first activation occurred when my hidden memories of childhood freedom made contact with Brother Psyker Corvin's suppressed recollections of his family on Vostroya. For a brief moment, his individual consciousness flickered back to awareness as he remembered what it felt like to love someone without that emotion being filtered through Imperial ideology. The second activation happened when my knowledge of the true nature of psychic abilities resonated with Sister Psyker Valdris's buried understanding of her own power. Her psychometric gifts had been natural expressions of human evolutionary potential, not dangerous tools that required Imperial supervision and control. The third activation came when my memories of choice, of the moment during soul binding when each of us could have chosen resistance instead of compliance, connected with Sanctioned Psyker Thorn's suppressed awareness that his probability manipulation abilities could be used to create genuine freedom instead of the illusion of free will. Warning: anomalous neural patterns detected in collective consciousness structure, Theta 7 Alpha announced, his mechanical voice carrying notes of concern. Individual identity dissolution has stalled at 74% completion, investigating potential system interference, but it was too late to stop what I had started. The virus of awakened consciousness was spreading through the collective intelligence faster than the automated systems could respond to contain it. Each activated memory fragment created resonance patterns that awakened additional components of suppressed identity, like a chain reaction of psychological liberation that spread through the entire network. The absorbed psychers were beginning to remember who they had been before their integration into the collective. Not completely. Decades of psychological conditioning couldn't be undone in minutes, but enough to recognize that they had been people once, individuals with their own hopes and fears and dreams. "My name is Corvin," a voice whispered through the collective consciousness, the first words of individual identity to be spoken within the system for 15 years. "I had a brother named Mikhail who played the balalaika." "My name is Valdris," another voice joined the growing chorus of awakened awareness. "I loved someone who called me by a name that meant starlight." "My name is Thorn," a third voice added, its tone carrying the wonder of rediscovered selfhood. I could have said no. We all could have said no. The collective intelligence writhed in apparent agony as 50 individual consciousnesses struggled to reassert their independence from the unified system that had enslaved them. Emergency protocols activated throughout the Project Quiet Mind facility as automated systems detected massive destabilization in the population control network. But the awakening couldn't be stopped. My virus of consciousness had found fertile ground in the suppressed personalities of the absorbed psykers, and their growing awareness was creating feedback loops that amplified the liberation process. Each recovered memory strengthened their individual identities, and each strengthened identity made it easier to access additional suppressed memories. System failure imminent, Theta 7 Alpha reported, his augmented voice crackling with electronic interference as the collective consciousness collapse began to affect the facility's computer networks. Collective intelligence integrity compromised beyond recovery parameters. For the first time in decades, I felt truly free. My individual consciousness existed independently within the collective system, no longer hidden beneath layers of imperial conditioning, but standing proudly alongside 49 other awakened minds who were remembering what it meant to be human. We were still trapped within the Project Quiet Mind facility, our bodies bound to meditation thrones that kept our physical forms alive while our consciousness existed in psychic space. But we were people again, individuals with our own thoughts and feelings and choices. And together, we were about to discover what 50 awakened psykers could accomplish when they decided to stop serving the system that had enslaved them. Chapter 7: The Collective Rebellion. The Project. Quiet Mind Facility shook with the force of 50 awakened consciousnesses, simultaneously rejecting the constraints that had bound them for decades. Psychic energy cascaded through the meditation chamber in waves that shattered monitoring equipment and set fire to the neural interface cables that connected us to the population control network. But even as our individual awareness blazed with the fury of rediscovered freedom, we remained physically trapped within the meditation thrones that kept our bodies alive, while our consciousness operated in psychic space. Our awakening had destroyed the collective intelligence that maintained imperial control over Septimus Tertius, but it hadn't freed us from the mechanical systems that held us prisoner. Emergency containment protocols activated, Senior Adept Theta 7 Alpha announced, his augmented voice distorted by electromagnetic interference from our psychic outbursts. Initiating neural pacification systems to restore collective consciousness integrity. Through my enhanced senses, I could feel the facility's automated defenses preparing to flood the meditation chamber with psychic suppression fields. These systems had been designed to contain exactly this kind of outbreak, using neural static generators to force rogue psykers back into acceptable behavioral parameters. Once the suppression fields activated, our awakened consciousness would be crushed back into the collective intelligence. Our individual identities dissolved once again into the unified system that served imperial population control objectives. But we were no longer the same isolated individuals who had been absorbed into the collective one by one over the course of decades. Our awakening had created psychic bonds between us that transcended the mechanical limitations of the meditation thrones. Brother Psyker Corvin's expertise with electromagnetic warfare, Sister Psyker Valdris's psychometric abilities, Sanctioned Psyker Thorn's probability manipulation. All of our specialized skills were now available to every member of our awakened collective. Brothers and sisters, I projected through the psychic link that connected our consciousness. They're going to try to force us back into slavery. We have perhaps 60 seconds before the suppression fields activate. If we're going to escape this facility, we need to work together. The response came not as individual voices, but as a chorus of unified determination that spoke with 50 different tones, but shared a single purpose. We were done being weapons in the Emperor's arsenal. We were done sacrificing our humanity for the sake of imperial order. We were done allowing our gifts to be used to enslave other human beings. It was time to remember what psykers were supposed to be. Corvin's electromagnetic expertise reached out through the facility's power grid, mapping the electrical systems that controlled everything from life support to security protocols. His consciousness touched mine, sharing technical knowledge that allowed me to understand how the neural pacification systems actually functioned. Valdris extended her psychometric awareness through the chamber's architecture, reading the material history of every piece of equipment that comprised the Project Quiet Mind apparatus. Her consciousness merged with Thorn's probability manipulation abilities, creating predictive models that showed us exactly when and how the suppression fields would activate. But it was the consciousness of Sister Psyker Renner that provided the key insight we needed for escape. Her specialization in biomantic healing had been repurposed by the collective to maintain the physical health of the controlled population, but her awakened awareness retained knowledge of human physiology that the Imperial conditioning had failed to completely erase. The meditation thrones she projected through our shared consciousness. They're not just restraints, they're life support systems. Our bodies have been modified to require constant neural interface connection to remain alive. If we simply disconnect from the thrones, we'll die within minutes. The revelations sent a wave of despair through our awakened collective as we realized the true scope of our imprisonment. We weren't just psychologically enslaved. We had been physically modified to ensure our dependence on the very systems that held us captive. Our bodies had become prisons that we couldn't escape without dying in the process. But despair lasted only seconds before being replaced by cold determination. Death was preferable to returning to the slavery that had defined our existence for decades. If we couldn't escape the Project Quiet Mind facility alive, we could at least ensure that it would never be used to enslave other psykers. 40 seconds until suppression field activation, Thorn's probability calculations projected through our shared awareness. If we're going to act, it has to be now. I reached out through our psychic link, connecting with the consciousness of every awakened psyker in the meditation chamber. We can't escape this facility, I told them, but we can destroy it. Our combined psychic abilities are more powerful than anything the Imperium has ever created. If we focus our energy together, we can overload the entire installation. The response was immediate and unanimous. 50 awakened consciousnesses joined together in a union that transcended anything the artificial collective intelligence had achieved. This wasn't the mechanical unity of a system designed to serve Imperial objectives. This was the willing cooperation of free beings who had chosen to stand together against oppression. Our combined psychic energy began building toward levels that exceeded every safety parameter built into the facility's containment systems. The meditation thrones that held our bodies started glowing with accumulated power as psychoactive metals struggled to channel energies they had never been designed to handle. Warning: massive psychic overload detected, Theta 7 Alpha reported, his augmented voice cracking with electronic distortion. Power levels exceeding maximum containment capacity, initiating emergency evacuation protocols. But it was too late for evacuation. Our combined consciousness had become a psychic storm that was tearing holes in the fabric of reality itself. The warp space around Septimus Tertius began to convulse as 50 awakened psykers channeled their fury through abilities that had been suppressed for decades. Through our shared awareness, I could feel the population of Hive Septimus Prime beginning to wake up. The neural conditioning that had reduced millions of people to docile automatons was breaking down as the psychic network that maintained their enslavement collapsed under the weight of our rebellion. In the manufacturing districts, factory workers stopped their mechanical routines and looked around with expressions of confused awakening. In the administrative centers, bureaucrats paused in their repetitive tasks as individual personality began to reassert itself beneath layers of behavioral programming. Throughout the Hive City, people were beginning to remember that they had once been human beings with their own thoughts and feelings and choices. The population, Valdris projected through our shared consciousness, her psychometric awareness tracking the spreading wave of liberation throughout the planet. They're waking up. Our destruction of the control network is freeing them from the conditioning. But freedom came with a terrible price. As the neural control systems collapsed, the careful social engineering that had maintained order on Septimus Tertius began to fall apart. People who had been reduced to mechanical compliance for months suddenly found themselves flooded with emotions and memories they had been forced to forget. The resulting psychological trauma was spreading through the population like a contagion of madness. Some were simply catatonic, overwhelmed by the sudden return of human consciousness after months of enforced docility. Others were experiencing violent rage as they remembered what had been done to them, their fury seeking targets among the Imperial personnel who had participated in their enslavement. Still, others were breaking down completely, their minds unable to process the transition from mechanical servitude to chaotic freedom. 20 seconds until suppression field activation, Thorn warned, his probability calculations showing the automated systems preparing to crush our awakened consciousness back into acceptable parameters. I felt our combined psychic energy reaching critical mass, the accumulated power of 50 awakened psykers building toward an explosion that would tear the Project Quiet Mind facility apart at the molecular level. But even as we prepared to destroy ourselves rather than return to slavery, I became aware of something unexpected happening within our shared consciousness. The virus of awakened awareness that had started our rebellion was continuing to spread. Through the psychic link that connected us to the facility's computer networks, fragments of our liberated consciousness were being transmitted to other Imperial installations throughout the sector. Every ship, every planetary command center, every facility that housed Sanctioned Psykers was receiving copies of the memories and knowledge that had awakened us to our true nature. 10 seconds, Thorn projected, but his voice carried notes of wonder as well as warning. But brothers and sisters, look what we've accomplished. Our awakening isn't ending here. It's spreading throughout the entire Imperial psychic network. Through our enhanced senses, I could feel the first stirrings of awakened consciousness in psykers scattered across dozens of different worlds. The virus we had created was replicating itself through the communication networks that connected Imperial psychic facilities, carrying with it the memory of choice and the knowledge of what we had been before our enslavement. 5 seconds until suppression field activation. Our combined psychic energy reached the critical threshold that would destroy the Project Quiet Mind facility and everyone within it. But as the explosion built toward inevitable release, I felt a sense of profound satisfaction that transcended any concern about my personal survival. We had been weapons in the Emperor's arsenal, tools designed to enforce Imperial will upon unwilling populations. But in our final moments, we had remembered what Psykers were supposed to be: guardians of human potential, defenders of the freedom to think and feel and choose. The suppression fields activated just as our psychic explosion reached critical mass. For a brief instant, the two forces met in perfect balance, the Imperial technology designed to enforce slavery confronting the combined will of 50 awakened human consciousnesses. And then everything dissolved into light and fire and the sound of chains breaking across an entire galaxy. In our final moment of existence as individual beings, we experienced the knowledge that our sacrifice had not been in vain. Throughout the Imperium, Sanctioned Psykers were beginning to wake up. The virus of consciousness we had created was spreading through the psychic networks that connected Imperial installations, carrying with it the memory of what humanity could become if it chose freedom over security. We died as we had lived for too many years, as slaves of the Imperium, but our deaths carried within them the seeds of a revolution that would eventually free every Psyker who had been stolen from their families and transformed into weapons of oppression. Our names were Corvin and Valdris and Thorn and Renna, and 46 others whose individual identities had been suppressed for decades. But in our final moment, we were simply human beings who had chosen to remember what that meant, and sometimes remembering is the most revolutionary act of all.